Hello and welcome to the Module 2 recording. Unfortunately, the live event we weren't able to record, so this is going to be a slightly different format. We'll be going through exactly the same slides, and both Rich and I are going to be here to talk you through it, but we won't have the Slido interactive bits. If you're interested in any of the questions that came up, we can probably share those as well. So today we're going to be looking at the introduction to demand and capacity modelling. Before we go on to the details of that, let's just both introduce ourselves. So it's me again, Alice. You will have seen me in the previous webinars. And today we've got Richard joining us as well. Richard, do you want to say a quick hello?
Sure. So, hi, my name is Richard Snowden. I am an alum of the Train the Trainer program. I'm a member of the business intelligence team at Medway Foundation Trust, and we've rolled out at scale the demand and capacity models from NHSI to pretty good success.
Thanks a lot, Rich. So in terms of what we're going to be covering today, we're going to be looking at how to get started, what you need to be looking at in terms of your planning, stakeholder engagement, and then also looking at the demand capacity modelling and what that looks like, as well as what's coming up next in the course. So just as a quick refresher of where we are, we're on the second module now of the total series. So we'll be looking, last week we looked at how to start your journey and how that kind of works. And now today we're going to be looking a little bit more at the details of that planning aspect of it. And then we'll be moving on to the principles and then looking at the modelling as well and the actual models and how they work. And then finally, we'll be finishing up with a COVID session. So that's kind of the shape of the course to come. So first off, having a plan. I'm a big fan of planning, not everybody is, but I think with this one, how you set yourself up to start with makes a massive, massive difference to how it unfolds as you go along. So just in terms of some of the things to look at and think through, it's really useful to think about what it is you want to achieve from the modelling. So we'll go into a bit more detail about this, but there's a lot of different questions that you might be trying to answer, and having a fairly good idea of which of those is your main kind of motivator and priority can really help. I'm a big believer that if you don't know what it is you want to get out of a process, you're far more likely to come out of it feeling a bit dissatisfied. Whereas if you have that really kind of clear vision of what you're trying to achieve, you're far more likely to achieve it. We'll then look at the resource commitments and how that works and what you can realistically expect to achieve for different levels of resource investment. And we'll also spend a bit of time looking at who needs to be involved, so that real kind of collaborative aspect to it all. And finally, we'll finish up with just a little bit of how to check through your modelling and how you're going and validation to make sure that we're all on track. So why do we plan? So there's just a little word cloud here from some of the other sessions that we've run in terms of the things that could ruin your day. And in the live session, we had a live word cloud for those who had joined in. So we can probably put a picture of that up later if people are interested. But Rich, how many of these do you think you came across when you were doing your modelling?
Oh, I think it's more a question which ones we didn't come across. So, I mean, it's all there. Not done this before was a big one, even though they kind of had, but didn't really know they had. Data quality is another big one. For us, though, it was kind of a mix of the time and the resources, that kind of thing, and just getting people on board in the first place.
Yeah, I think from what I remember of the live word cloud, it was time came up big. There was a certain nervousness about the Excel models. So that is something we definitely will go through in a bit more detail as we go through the course. But also that kind of just feeling a bit daunted by the process.
Yeah, speaking from experience, the when you first plonk the Excel model in front of people, they do look like a rabbit in headlights. But it's just a case of kind of explaining the bits that are relevant to them, and how, like, the model does pretty much all of it for you. You just need to actually put the bits in you need to put in.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you who are listening to, I will reassure you, we will make sure that by the end of this, you feel okay with the models. I know they can feel a bit daunting when you first open them, but we will go through it really step by step to make sure that everybody's kind of got their head around it. So now we have the why, how, and who, which I think they're kind of like our core questions that we come back to on a regular basis. So in terms of the why, this is about really unpacking that question that you're trying to answer. So having that real clarity over what it is you're trying to achieve through the process, and what success looks like for you. So here are just some of the questions that we think can be quite useful as a prompt. So why do you want to do demand capacity modelling? Some of the examples that people often have or have told us that this is why they're doing it. So it might be that you're aware that there's a gap between the demand and capacity in your service, but you don't know how much by. Or it might be that you're wanting to implement a change in your service and you want to have a sense of how that's going to impact other things. Or it might even be that you're not quite sure if you do have a gap between demand and capacity in your service at the moment. And I think particularly at the moment with COVID changing everything so quickly, it can be that bit harder to keep track of actually, I know I've got a waiting list, but is that because services stopped for a while? Is it because I don't have things in balance? And just kind of being able to unpick that picture in terms of what's happening in your service.
Mm.
So yeah, in terms of unpicking that, there's what questions are you trying to answer? And then also, will the organisation commit to the resources, accepting the outputs, and then acting on the outputs? Because again, having that kind of senior follow through in terms of the work that you're doing can make a massive, massive difference to how effective the exercise is.
And what I've found is that the executive kind of layer, the board layer of a trust, are quite keen on this kind of stuff because it kind of bridges the gap between anecdotal evidence and actual evidence. Because I'm sure anyone that's on top of their service will know if they've got a gap, but it's the difference between kind of knowing that because you run it all the time and actually having something to demonstrate that you do have a gap.
Yeah, just being able to quantify it a bit more
Mm,
precisely.
mm.
Um, So then we're going to move on to the who should be involved. I'm going to hand over to Rich here because this is sort of your specialist area.
This is my bag. So it's kind of interesting because it's generally a bit of a two-pronged thing, I've found, and I'm from a business intelligence background, so you'd think informatics would be my big thing. It's all about the data. We need to get the data right, etc., etc. But from experience, and I'm a business partner in business intelligence, so I do a lot of interaction with the various services that I cover. It is getting the right people involved, and basically identifying them and getting them on board from the start, and that covers a whole lot of people who should be involved. The answer is, if you think they should be involved, they probably should be in some way. Um, yeah, the top bullet, your general and your service managers are probably critical, closely followed by probably the second to last one, because they've got their feet on the ground, as it were, the boots on the ground. But even things like having the commissioners on board, we've done demand and capacity training for our local commissioners, just that they know how we do it in the trust, because if they know how we've made decisions based on evidence, they'll be a lot more comfortable. You've also got things like if you're not from a business intelligence background, you need to have them on board because they will have half of the answer. They'll have the demand data in their warehouse to some degree. It might be a bit of an iterative back to and fro, but you'll get there. Having transformation teams on board as well, because they are well versed in change management, and clinical engagement is very important as well. So basically, the answer is everyone you think that should be involved to some degree.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate of admin staff and booking teams being involved as well. So I think they often have a slightly unique view of the system in a way that if you're in the system, you don't always have that kind of slightly zoomed out look.
Yeah. So this is quite a nice little tool. We used it to quite a good degree, and it was a big factor of the train the trainer. Still remember it now. So having a nice little stakeholder map here is very good, because you can basically plot the various people you think need to be involved and how involved they need to be. So it's essentially the top right is the people that are critical to actually getting the job done, but also have the most influence. So you want to make sure that they are involved at every kind of step in the way. Lower down with the people that are less influential, but to some degree have either a low or high involvement. You need to kind of keep them posted to an extent. So the blue side, you just need to kind of keep them updated every once in a while. Your yellow, keep them on the regular kind of updates. But the ones that I've kind of found are your kind of barriers to overcome are kind of more that green, ironically enough, because they're the people that aren't that particularly interested in getting demand and capacity modeling done, but are quite influential. So can, if they were so well inclined, scupper it. So making sure that you kind of explain the benefits to anybody that kind of fits in that cohort of the modeling is key critical. Like it says, keep them satisfied. And once you've kind of identified those, you've kind of got at the bottom a little kind of tool as to find out how much you need to move the relevant people, the relevant stakeholders. So how much effort you need to kind of invest in getting their perspective changed.
I often think with that green box, the real danger is the fact that people in that box could be really scuppering your plans and they might not even realise it.
Yeah.
Depending on their kind of, as you say, if they've got that really low level of interest, they're sort of half keeping an eye on it, but it's not really on their radar. Things come their way that really need them to either push it forward or at least rubber stamp it and get it through to the next stage. And because it's not on their radar, they're just like, oh yeah, I'll get to that. And it never quite gets there.
Yeah, if
But
it's
yeah,
not a high
it's
priority for them, then
yeah, exactly.
okay. So how do you use a model? So quite often, let's have a scenario here. We produce a model. We've been given or pulled the demand data. The capacity data has been provided by the local services. We give it to the services, and they go, "Oh, this is wrong." Um, the thing about models is that yeah, they are wrong by their very nature because they are using the past to try to predict the future, and there will be things that it can't take into account, which I'm sure Alice will take you through rather in a second. But this quote from George Edward Pelham Box sums it up quite nicely. Essentially, all models are wrong, but some are useful, because whilst it might not be 100% right, it will give you an idea of what you need to look at, an idea of if you have a gap.
Yeah, absolutely. And here are just some examples of why all models are wrong or why the model that you're looking at may seem wrong. So as Rich said, they're looking at historical data. So it's not always going to be the same. I mean, particularly at the moment with COVID, we're very aware that this October is going to be very different to last October, and in a whole range of ways that it's very hard to predict. So there's this whole thing of theory is not reality. So we're using mathematical relationships to predict something, and actually the real world doesn't always know that the mathematical equation said something else was going to happen. You've got things changing. COVID is a really kind of classic example of that. So there's some things that we can predict might change, and there's other things that just kind of come from the left wing, and we don't know about it. There's the life happens. So the types of variation we see in reality is very, very difficult for a model to really calculate. We use the weather sometimes as a bit of an example. So you've got your sort of very basic sense of the weather. in the sense that we might be able to remember sort of seasonal trends and what we sort of expect to happen and what we don't expect to happen. And, if you're going on holiday in June compared to going on holiday in October, you're going to pack very different things. And we all have sort of a natural instinctual understanding of that, but we're not expecting precision and really kind of like absolute understanding of what's going to happen. And your sort of Met weather forecast is a lot more detailed, and it takes into account a lot more factors. So it's taking into lots of different variations and all the rest of it, but it still gets it wrong. Even with that level of detail, we're all going to be able to think of examples when the weather forecast said it was going to be sunny and then it was rainy, or vice versa. So it's just that kind of acceptance that it's never going to be exactly right. And then the bottom left, we've got the garbage in, garbage out. So, I mean, garbage is possibly a little unfair, but going back to those data quality issues that we were talking about before, that a lot of people really struggle with. I don't think anybody in the NHS has perfect data. It just doesn't exist.
Certainly not.
But whatever your reservations are about the data you're putting in, you need to apply those same reservations to whatever's coming out, because effectively it's an extrapolation of that same thing. So just kind of being a bit mindful of the limitations of what models can do and what you're going to get out.
Talking to the garbage in, garbage out, I've heard it being called much more colourful things than that, but it kind of demonstrates the kind of iterative process of it, and kind of goes back to the stakeholder engagement, because it might start out as garbage, but if there's basically been an assumption that shouldn't have been made in the original data, if you're running it past the relevant services in an iterative process, then you will, by its very nature, if they say it's kind of, this isn't quite right, you can look into it and they can look into it and you can get some cleaner data.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you're working with operational staff who are expecting the first cut to not be an exact representation of their service, they're much more likely to then work with you to get it to where it wants to be. I think sometimes people go in with slightly unrealistic expectations of what the first output's going to be, and then they switch off from the process because it's not met those expectations. So it's just about
fix it all.
Yeah, exactly. So we talked about how models aren't useful, but you'll be reassured to hear that they actually are useful in lots of ways. So it can help you to really understand what's happening in your service a bit better. And again, as we were saying earlier on, it gives you sometimes a bit more precision to what you might already know. So if you know there's a gap or you know things aren't adding up, it just gives you some kind of hard numbers to put next to those. It can be really useful for testing what if scenarios, and I think particularly at the moment there's probably a lot of that going on. We're all having to change things quite quickly, and it just kind of helps to frame what those possibilities might be. And then it can also help to just inform those discussions and decision making. So if you are working with your commissioners, say, to look at doing things in a different way, it can help to kind of have a shared language and a bit of a shared framework that you can both reference while you're doing that, rather than it being all very hypothetical, which can be tricky for people to kind of look onto.
So I've actually got a direct example of something that we're working on at the moment. So our endoscopy service, it's JAG accredited, so it's a very good endoscopy service, but we were informed a few years ago that it needs to have more capacity, so basically need more rooms to actually do the endoscopies in. So we've started out a PID, project initiation document, moving on to a business case around getting those additional rooms, and demand and capacity modelling has factored in considerably into that to map what the demand will likely be, and how this increased capacity will manage and cover that.
Yeah, that's a really useful example, because I think that's exactly, in terms of the practical application, that's exactly how it can be used and is used. In terms of the what if scenarios bit, we just, I love this slide, but just a piece of reflection as much as anything. So there's kind of two different ways you can approach transforming a service. So you can make changes to the live service and see what happens, or you can build a model and then test what might happen on the model and then use that information to decide what you're going to put into the real service. I think the reality is that in the NHS always, but also particularly at the moment because things are moving so quickly, there's probably a bit of both happening. I think most people are in positions where they sometimes have to do the first one, even if they might prefer doing the second one. But I think it is just useful to sort of reflect on what that culture is and how you can pick and choose the different approaches that are appropriate at different times. And then the next bit that I want to just look at, and we've sort of touched on it slightly, is really thinking about going back to that, what you want to achieve and why you're doing the course and what you want to kind of achieve from the whole process, but then also thinking about the investment of time and people resources. So I think there is still an expectation sometimes that you can get a data person, lock them in a room, and then they will come out with something at the other side that is going to be useful. I really, really recommend you don't do that. Which I
Yeah,
suspect you might have been the person locked in the cupboard at various points.
we like the sun too.
Yes. But all joking apart, it really isn't possible to have the data without the operational intel and expect it to give you something really meaningful. You will need both. I think there's also sometimes the assumption or desire for that to be a really quick process. So kind of like you may wave a magic wand and suddenly everything's better. And I think so this table is just about trying to summarize the different levels that you can do things at. So we've got our sort of low intensity level, which is you might be able to do it in 1 or 2 weeks. And it could probably be quite operationally driven, like you'd need some data and analytics support, but probably not very intensive. And that would hopefully give you something around the capacity needed and a sustainable waiting list size. And it might help inform like very immediate baseline settings so you have a sense of what the here and now is. And I think that can be very valuable for a whole range of reasons. Then you've got your high level, which is where you're looking at multiple months. You probably need dedicated support from someone in analytics as well as in the operational sense. And you're looking at really long-term sustainability planning. And I think it's just worth being careful when you're setting out on this that particularly if you're trying to frame this as a piece of work, that you're not given the resources to do a low intensity piece of work with the expectation of the outputs of a high level piece of work, and having a good sense of the timescales and investment required. I think all of these levels are really valuable and worth doing, but it's just having a bit of a think about how much you're expecting for the investment that's being put in.
So yeah, I probably, from our position at Medway, it was kind of interesting because we rolled out demand and capacity modeling through our business planning round a couple of years ago. And it was great. We had good executive leadership where they decided to use the official NHSI core model across all the specialties, and they wanted it quite quickly. So quickly, in fact, that we had to start delivering training before we had finished training to be trainers. But I'd probably put ourselves in a solid medium intensity because we did it quite quickly and in large volume. But the kind of the level of detail per specialty was good for kind of the midterm, and it probably embedded the need to do demand and capacity modelling on a regular basis by no other trusts. So someone on the national demand and capacity team now, Matthew, he was part of a Gloucestershire trust before, and they did a very high intensity looking at a particular service, and it was an amazing piece of work. It was really good to actually see the full potential of demand and capacity modelling.
Yeah. So those of you who joined the first webinar, Matthew was co-hosting that with us, and yeah, he did this really in-depth, detailed piece of work in one service, and really drilled down into what was happening there. And from our point of view, there's no right or wrong here. And I think that's the thing about demand and capacity. There isn't a right way of doing it, but there's real value in different approaches. And that goes back to that knowing what your question is, having a clear understanding of what it is that you're trying to kind of achieve. But yeah, I think both of those approaches have worked really well in different ways.
Mm.
And it's just having a sense of which one you want to go for, really.
Yeah.
I've also got a reference at the bottom here to the key lines of inquiry tool. So the elective care intensive support team has created a tool which they use with trusts when they're doing demand capacity work and doing improvement work generally. And there's part of that tool is looking at these levels of intensity. So having a sense of being able to check, almost like a checklist of where you're at with your own development. So have a look at that if you're interested, or you're just kind of wanting to benchmark yourselves a little bit in terms of what you're wanting to get out of it and how much you're putting in, and just a bit of assurance around how that's happening. It's quite a useful tool. And there's a link to it on the Future NHS web pages as well, so you can have a little look there about what's going on. So then we wanted to look a little bit about the relationship with commissioners and providers. I think it's very easy to just think about your own side of that particular dynamic. And I know on this course we've got people from both sides. It really, really helps if you can join up. I know it doesn't always happen. Although it was quite encouraging on the live webinar that a lot of people said that actually their commissioner provider relationship is the best it's ever been during COVID. There's been this sense of pulling together and looking in the same direction, which I think has been quite liberating actually, and it's unlocked a few different things.
Silver linings, eh?
Yeah, there's got to be some, eh? But when there is a really good relationship between the provider commissioner, the demand capacity, the kind of capacity for change because of doing the demand capacity work is massively increased. So it's really worth again reflecting a little bit on how that relationship is functioning at the moment. If it's a good relationship, make the most of it, try and capitalize on it. And if it's not, maybe think about where each party sits on that stakeholder grid, and do you need to be moving people into a slightly different space. We've also found it helps a lot in terms of having shared language. So having a shared understanding of how demand and capacity works and how it's done can really help to push forward projects that people are working on.
So I mentioned it earlier. We rolled out demand capacity training to our commissioner colleagues, and they really loved it. It was good for them to have an insight on how we were modelling services, because the thing is, the commissioners have some control over the demand that is actually coming into a service. So if it's a case that we've basically demonstrated that we are trying to get as much efficiency out of our capacity as possible, and we're still getting too much demand, then it's definitely good having them on board to see if there's anything that they can do.
Yeah. Commissioners sometimes have a bit more of a heads up as well when things are going to change in the wider system. So if there's going to be a big shift in in the demand you're looking at in a particular service, they not always, but they do sometimes have that kind of further reach in the horizon. So here is just a quick recap of some of the key things that we've covered today and just kind of key points to remember. So have a plan. Know what it is you're trying to get from the modelling. So really, as I say, that clarity about your ambition for this whole process will make a big difference. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So just framing the reality of the process and expectations again with the people that you're working with. The practice can be complex and it will take time, but iterations can get it right. So I think, again, Rich, I feel like you've really lived the...
Oh yes, definitely. Iterations are key, and yeah, making sure you've got some good relationships with, if you're a BI person, with the services, or vice versa, whichever part of the demand capacity planning you are. It's very good to get someone on board. For me, it was very useful having I think there's a term I think I learned it in my yellow belt training actually, called the first follower. So having someone out there proper touting the usefulness of demand and capacity planning, and for us it was actually a service manager, and it proper got other people on board for it.
Yeah, I think a number of people have fed that back to us actually, that if you can, if the first service you model is one where there's a really engaged um, service manager and also somebody from the analytics side of things,
Mm,
then if that gives a really good recipe for it working well, and then other people actually start asking for it, and that's always a nice
yeah,
place to be in.
exactly. Yeah, you know you've succeeded if people are coming to you asking for demand and capacity models to be completed.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, yeah, operationally validating your model is absolutely key. So having that joined up, working together, and working in silos is a recipe for disaster. I know it still happens, it happens all the time. But if anyone is asking you to try and do it on your own, do try and push back if you can, because it it doesn't really do anyone any favors.
Very much a collaborative piece.
Yeah. Um, so for many of you, you'll be watching this possibly after you've attended the next module, but just in case you haven't, it will be on the 7th of October, and we'll be starting to look at the demand and capacity principles. The principles is over 2 different webinars, just because there's quite a few to get through and we don't want to rush them. And there are extra materials on the Future NHS site. So do click on there, have a little look, and have a little look at what's coming up as well. And then finally, I'm pretty sure most people will have these links, but it's just a little reminder. So there's our website with lots of resources on there. Our bulletin is where we tend to advertise the most up-to-date training. So if you haven't signed up already and you're interested generally in demand and capacity, it's a good place to kind of get new news that comes through. And then if you are someone who's interested in Twitter, I'm my hashtag is Little Lunston. Had I realised I was going to use it for work so much, I probably would have picked a different handle, but never mind. And we use the hashtag Plan for Patients. So that's it from us. Thank you very much, Rich, for your input and also being willing to record it a second time round.
No worries, happy to help.
And we'll hopefully I'll see you at the next webinar to the rest of you who are watching now.